Good morning, welcome. Thank you for joining us once again. As has normally been the case, I'm going to start with some announcements and then some thoughts pertaining to the Lord's table. If you'd like to skip that, you can check the timestamp down below and go right to the lesson. To begin with, for announcements, I want to continue to encourage you and thank you for all of the good things that you have been doing. I talked to a number of you through the week. I know that you're calling one another, that you're encouraging, that you're checking in on one another, you're helping one another in a number of ways. Also, I want to again mention those ladies who've been working hard at making face masks. And along those lines, I'll point out I was talking to Edith this week, and she is out of material. So if you have some cotton material that perhaps you could donate, that would be very much appreciated, or any other of the materials that are needed. I know, go ahead and send me an email or call the church and let me know. And then, I can follow up to see of the number of ladies, there are 4 or 5 of them making those masks. I can check in with them and see who needs those materials and how to distribute which in the best way possible. I also want to thank those of you who've done a great job distributing those masks. I know tons of them have gone out, and what we've done, each one has been, whoever's distributing them sanitizes themselves first, puts the masks in a Ziploc bag along with a card from the church. And so it's just been a really, really good effort. And I want to thank everyone involved with that, as well to thank everyone involved with the calling. There are a number of members here, and it was important to make sure that we continued to maintain and improve our relationships, and we continue to care for one another. And those of you who've been on the call list, and others, I know there are a number of you who have not volunteered to be part of the phone tree, but have on your own gone out of your way to reach out to lots of different people. And so thank you for doing that, and I want to encourage you to continue, as it's going to be a little longer that we have to do this. And that brings us to our next announcement. We did send out an email, 2 emails in fact, one with our safety protocols. And in fact, if you, I will post a video shortly once we kind of get some other stuff cleaned up downstairs, kind of outlining, how the room is laid out and what the process we're gonna go through when we do start meeting. So look for that video, but in the meantime, you can check the list of precautions and protocols that we have created that sort of outlines how a typical worship service is going to go. All right, that's already been created, it's already been distributed. If you haven't seen it, get in touch with me and I'll make sure that you get a copy. I will also, along with the bulletin and sermon outline, I always print off some hard copies and put them downstairs. I will put some hard copies of those protocols downstairs as well. So all of that should be very, very easily accessible to you. We are looking at, after, consulting with a number of people, various members of the congregation, as well as the trustees, and hearing what others are doing, we're probably looking at an August start. Okay, now even in August, we'll still be taking all of the precautions that we have outlined. And of course, that is subject to change. If something happens, we get some kind of a big spike or there's some problem, we may have to reassess that. But that's sort of the tentative plans that are in place now. Okay, so I want to try to keep everybody updated. I know that a lot of people are anxious to be meeting again. And by the way, I know some are not anxious. Some are actually anxious to leave the house. And whatever your case may be, just know that we're praying for you. And if there's anything we can do, don't hesitate to touch base. And whatever concerns you have, we are specifically looking for feedback on those plans. So please get in touch with me and let me know about that, myself or any of the trustees that you happen to be talking to. Okay, now, those are the primary announcements that I have from this platform. Please check your bulletin. There are other things in there. And of course, the one thing we do need to say right off the start, I know we've already been going for a little bit, is to wish everyone a very happy Father's Day. I hope all of you fathers out there are enjoying the blessings of family in the way that God intended. I know nothing brings me more joy than playing with my boys and doing activities with them and seeing them grow. And it's such a joy, while at the same time, a great deal of responsibility. And I know as fathers, we feel that pressure to do our very, very best. And so I wish you all of God's blessings as you endeavor to be the very best possible dad that you can be. Now, having said that, I want to transition, and so if you need to stop the video now so that you can say a prayer, so that you can prepare the emblems, whatever the case may be, go ahead and do that. All right, today, the text we're going to look at for the Lord's table comes from Matthew chapter 26, a very, very common passage that you'll hear read as we partake of these emblems. And I want to share some thoughts that come directly out of these verses. So first of all, we talked this week in Bible study about the institution, I guess it was last week, I should correct that, in Bible study, about the institution of the Lord's Supper and how it took place as part of the Passover. So if you want to sort of enrich your understanding of the Lord's Supper and to envision the situation as accurately as you can as Jesus instituted this memorial, do some research on what the Jewish Passover looked like, and you'll have an idea of what was all involved in that. And so maybe that will deepen your appreciation for the very first Lord's Supper, and therefore deepen your appreciation as you partake of the memorial. Now, having said that, while they were gathered for the Passover, Jesus decides to institute a new memorial that is going to institute some pretty powerful changes that are coming very quickly. So let's begin reading in Matthew chapter 26 and verse 26. It says, "Now, as they were eating, Jesus took bread, and after blessing it, broke it and gave it to the disciples and said, 'Take, eat, this is my body.' And he took a cup, and when he had given thanks, he gave it to them, saying, 'Drink of it, all of you. For this is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins. I tell you, I will not drink again of this fruit of the vine until that day when I drink it new with you in my Father's kingdom.'" First of all, Jesus initiates a memorial that is supposed to remind us of his sacrifice, of his body and his blood, his body that was beaten and his blood that was shed to redeem us from sin and to establish a covenant. That is an agreement between God and man, and one that we would not be worthy to be a part of were it not for the shedding of his blood, making us innocent. And so that's the first thing that I want to key in on briefly, is the idea of covenant. We've entered into an agreement with God, one that we're not worthy of, okay? It's not an agreement between equals, like when you go and sign a contract to buy a new car or house or something. This is an agreement between God and man, and it's one that we could not be party to if it weren't for the fact that Jesus shed his blood. And so all of the benefits, all of the blessings that come to those who are in Christ are only possible because Jesus made us worthy to be in Christ. Jesus made us worthy to be in fellowship with him and the Father, and therefore one another. And so the idea of covenant here is one that we ought to be thoughtful of or cognizant of when we are partaking of these emblems. The other idea here that's specifically mentioned is the idea of kingdom. And so now we are members of God's kingdom. We voluntarily entered into his service. We made him the Lord and King and ruler of our lives when we were baptized into Christ. And we agreed now to submit to him as our King and as our Lord, in addition to him being our Savior. The idea there of kingdom is the area where a reign is exercised. And in our hearts and our lives and our churches, those need to be the places where God reigns. I understand that God may not reign in the life of your friends or your neighbors or some of your family members, but for you and your life, you need to ensure that you understand that part of what you did when you became a Christian was allowed God to reign in your life. And then understand that we now live as ambassadors, as servants of that kingdom, so that we express God's reign in our lives through our behavior. We demonstrate his love and his grace. And the purpose of all of that is to allow others to enter into that same kingdom, the one that we are now a part of, the one that will last from now until eternity. And so I hope those thoughts are encouraging and helpful to you as you partake of these emblems, and that through this week, you remember who you are. you remember that you are in covenant with God through Christ. You're members of his body, of his church, of his kingdom. And therefore you understand that your actions are not driven by, whatever other political entity you may be involved with, whether you're a citizen here of Canada or of, the municipality of Meaford or a province of Ontario, or whether you're somewhere else. It is irrelevant because we're all members of God's kingdom, and that's where our first allegiance has to lie. We'll take a break now, and you may want to pause this, say a prayer, sing some hymns, and prepare for what we'll be doing in 1 second, which will be the lesson. Good morning, and a very happy Father's Day to you. I hope that everyone is having a great Father's Day and enjoying the blessings of family. I want to begin along those lines by reminding you of an experience that happened to me this week. I was getting ready for work. I was, around the kitchen doing this, that, and the other. In fact, I think I might have even been out of the house for a few minutes. And when I came back, my wife said, "Hey, you need to go see what Joel is wearing." So I went and found my son Joel, and sure enough, he was dressed in a polo shirt and a pair of khaki shorts, just like what I was wearing. And he actually said to me, "Dad, I decided I'd dress like you today." I said, "Well, thanks, buddy. That's cool." And we went around and did a bunch of stuff. And after a few minutes, though, he pointed out something that I thought was rather interesting. He said, "Dad, I didn't wear a watch." I thought, okay. That's a weird detail to point out, but what's the story there? He said, "Well, I've noticed that you haven't been wearing your watch very much lately, so I decided if I was going to dress like you, I wouldn't wear a watch either." That got me thinking, how closely is he watching what I'm doing if he notices that I haven't been wearing a watch lately? And he's right, it's been summer, it's been a little hotter, so you want to feel a little less encumbered, I suppose. The other thing is Joel and I have been doing some biking, and if you're biking, I don't know if you've ever tried to go biking with a watch on, but that pressure on your wrist is not so super comfortable. So he's right, I haven't been wearing a watch all that often. And so the fact that he picked up on that reminded me of how important it is to keep in our minds the fact that we are serving as an example for people around us. And they're noticing things that we probably had no idea that they were noticing, okay? And that's really, really important for us to remember. It's important, of course, as dads to remember that we're the example to the family, that our kids are watching what a good dad looks like, what a husband looks like. Our daughters are learning what a good husband looks like and what they should be looking for in a spouse. All right, but they're also learning how someone behaves in their work environment, how someone interacts with other people, what they believe about various political issues. And right now, with all of the things that are going on in the world and all the news stories that my kids are hearing, I get a lot of questions. Right? And my kids look to me to watch, how's Dad going to respond to this story? And sometimes they'll even say, "Dad, what do you think about that?" And so we really need to be aware of the fact that we really need to take our role as examples seriously. And that's the first point that I want to bring up. Oftentimes, I think, because of humility, because we just go through life and maybe we're not very observant, so we just assume that others aren't really caring all that much about what we do or what we say or what we think. And that likely is not the case. It's very, very likely, in fact, almost certain, that there are some people watching you and watching me that we haven't thought of. In fact, I would remind you of Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 5 and verse 14 said, "You are the light of the world." Right? The implication of that is there are a lot of people watching. In Philippians chapter 2 and verse 15, Paul said that Christians should shine as stars among a dark and crooked generation. Again, the implication is there are a lot of people, and even perhaps more challenging is there are people who don't think like us, there are people who don't believe like us that are watching us. These verses indicate that it's more, right, than just our close family and friends. I suppose most of us kind of assume that our children, that our grandchildren are kind of watching what we do and taking some cues from us. But it may not be just your children or your grandchildren. It may be the friend you play tennis with or that you go walking with every week. It may be the people you're interacting with on social media. It may be the people who you work with. All of those individuals could be looking at your example, especially, of course, if they know you're a Christian, which I hope they do, okay? It's pretty hard to be a faithful Christian and keep that from the people who are closest to you, all right? So they do know you're a Christian, and they want to know, what do Christians read? What do they act like? Where do they go? What are their hobbies? And remember that they come to this with all kinds of preconceived notions given to them by media and by friends and by books and all kinds of other sources. And so now they're like, hey, here's a real life Christian. I wonder if they live up to all the expectations that I've built up in my mind. And so we need to be aware of how closely we're watched. Maybe someone in your life notices when you stop wearing your watch, like my son noticed that I wasn't wearing mine. Maybe there are other reasons we don't think. Timothy was a young evangelist, and Paul reminds him to be an example. And perhaps Timothy needs to be reminded because he thinks, well, I'm a young guy. I'm working with this congregation who's older and experienced. They don't care what I'm doing. If anything, I should be looking to them as examples, not them to me. But Paul says, no. Right? You have the responsibility to be an example to the believers with whom you're working and worshiping. And so if for some reason you don't think that anyone is looking to your example, let me be the one to tell you that they are. And that you need to be very careful and very aware of what lessons you're teaching and what values you're communicating through the observed behaviors that people are witnessing. Now, let me qualify this with one quick statement, okay? And that is this. I'm not suggesting for a moment that we should somehow become so overly obsessed with appearance, okay, that we become shallow and just worried about how we look to everyone around us. That's not the point of this lesson. In fact, it's the opposite of that. What people should be seeing is who you really are. They should see a heart of love and godliness that demonstrates how a godly person would interact with the world. Okay, I'm not suggesting you need to worry about how well your hedges are trimmed or how clean your car is. I'm suggesting you be concerned about the status of your heart and how your heart for God is demonstrated to the world around you. The next point is perhaps, I don't know, these seem to get more challenging as they go. So I think this point is a little more challenging than the first one, and probably the last point is the most challenging of all. But this is really, really difficult, or can be very, very difficult. I want to share some passages with you that directly relate to being an example and point out that being an example needs to be qualified in a particular way. So look at Philippians chapter 3 and verse 17 where it says, "Brothers, join in imitating me and keep your eyes on those who walk according to the example you have in us." And then in the same book, just the next chapter over, Philippians chapter 4 and verse 9, "What you have heard and learned and received and seen in me, practice these things, and the God of peace will be with you." And then finally, 1 Corinthians chapter 11 and verse 1, probably the passage we all know best pertaining to this, "Be imitators of me as I am of Christ." Now, the reason I share all of these passages with you is because there's a huge implication in all of them, which is that being an example doesn't mean that you should expect those who are looking up to you, those who are following you, those who are watching your example to just blindly follow whatever you do. Paul said, "Follow me as I follow Christ." And the implication is, if I'm not following Christ, okay, you shouldn't do that. And that means we need to empower those who are looking to our example to challenge us, to question us, to understand that they have a responsibility before God. It's not going to work for them to just say, well, I saw so-and-so do that, so I figured it must be the right thing. I'm reminded of a humorous story along these lines. When I was a kid, and especially when my parents were kids, their family, my grandparents, used to do a lot of snowmobiling. And my grandpa tells a story about one day he was snowmobiling across, through an area up north, and he always, he did everything this way. He was moving pretty fast, okay? And so he went over a small cliff, a drop off, and because of his speed, he kind of carried over the edge and landed and kept going. Now, what he didn't know is that there were some people coming behind him. Some friends of his that were staying, in the same cabin with them. And they were following along, and the wife was driving. Their names escape me right now, so if some of you know this story, you can fill in the names. But anyway, they're following my grandpa's tracks, and the wife sees that there's a pretty steep hill coming, and she's not sure if it's safe to continue. And so she says to her husband, hey, look, there's a pretty steep hill coming. You think I should stop? And the husband said, well, do the tracks carry on? And she said, well, yeah, the tracks we're following carry on. He said, we should be fine. Just go ahead. And so they, following my grandfather, but not moving nearly as fast, drive straight over the edge of a cliff. Now, not a high cliff. No one died or anything like that. But, it was bad enough that apparently the husband, who was sitting on the back of the snowmobile looking backward, said, one minute I was kind of watching the trail go by, and the next minute all I could see was the sky. And so we need to be careful to remind those who are looking up to us that we're not perfect. Right? We need to make sure that we communicate very clearly, and especially as a dad to our children, okay, or as a mother to our children, as a Christian to the people around us. They need to know that we're not perfect, but that we're trying to the very best of our ability to follow Jesus, and it's ultimately Him who they need to follow. And true success will come not from raising children who are just like us, but will come from raising children who want to be just like Jesus. And so we need to help them think for themselves. We need to help them understand their responsibility, help them examine what they're doing. Encourage them to ask us questions, to challenge us. Why are you doing that? Why do you believe that? Why are you engaging in that behavior rather than this one? And we need to, that can be a difficult thing, guys. It really can, to have someone challenging you. But we need to help those who are looking to our example to examine our behaviors and our beliefs in the light of Scripture and in the light of reason, so that they can develop their own way of doing things, and they can develop their own understandings and their own faith, because someday we won't be there for them to follow, and we want to know with confidence that they have developed the skill set to allow them to be successful as servants of God. Finally, perhaps the most challenging of all of these is that the world is watching. The world is looking for you as a Christian to live up to their predictions, to measure against you their preconceived notions of what a Christian is like. And they've been told a lot of crazy stuff. One time, I can't tell you, being a minister, people will share things with me, especially as I develop relationships with them. I had someone tell me one time, I didn't think Christians believed in dinosaurs. I'm like, I don't know. None of the Christians I've ever met, okay? So I had to we had a whole conversation about why that's crazy, and I don't know where that idea came from. All right, but there are so many other examples that could be given. Right, that it would just go on and on and on about things that people have been told, perhaps bad experiences that they've had, books that they've read. Okay, it's not uncommon to hear crazy things said about Christians these days, and you have to then realize that many of your coworkers and your acquaintances and your friends will have some ideas in their mind about what a Christian is like, and they're going to be measuring those ideas against you and your life and the choices you make and the things that you do around them. And so being an example in that environment, right? Remember, we've looked at Philippians chapter 2:15 already, but remember 1 Peter 2:21, where Peter said that they may look to accuse you as evildoers. But then when they see your good works, right, that will be the thing that justifies you in their eyes. And so we ought to be reminded, okay, that doing the right thing can often be difficult. Okay, it can be even more difficult when we know that there are those with sort of a critical eye who are watching us. All right? And listen, I'm sure you've had this experience, all right? Have you ever had to do something? Maybe it's something you're so familiar with, you're so comfortable with it, you could do it blindfolded. You've done this activity 1,000 times, and then on one particular occasion, you have to do it with an audience. Right? You have to do it with a bunch of others watching your performance. And all of a sudden, that thing that was so easy that you could do blindfolded is extremely difficult, and you're fumbling and you can't communicate well, and you keep messing things up. And it's because, doing the right thing is not always easier when you're alone. I mean, wow, when you're observed. Okay, and I'm thinking, the reason I tripped over my words there is I'm thinking of the expression, right, that talks about integrity is doing the right thing when no one's watching, right? And that's a valuable saying, and we ought to be mindful of it. But sometimes it's more difficult to do the right thing when everyone's watching, because the pressure to conform is so great. The pressure to back off of your commitment to do the right thing can be very, very daunting. We need to remember, though, that light is brightest when we're in the darkness. Further, we need to remember that those people who are watching with a critical eye are the most important observers that we have. Because there's a chance that through our good example, that through our godliness, that through our demonstration of God's grace and his love and his truth, that they might be encouraged to seek that same truth and that same grace for themselves. I want you to just take a moment and think to yourself and ask yourself, what do you think the public perception of Christianity is right now? In 2020 in North America, what do you think most people think of Christians? And then to take those stereotypes that maybe you've heard about or had even shared with you, or you've read them in a book or seen them on television or somewhere else. Right? Think of those preconceived notions and then specifically look for opportunities to try and use those stereotypes as a teaching tool, to help people to question those stereotypes and show them who God really is and what his love really looks like. It's hard on Father's Day not to think of my dad. And my dad was far from perfect. Right? He made sure I understood that, but he also made sure I understood that what he was trying to do was to follow Jesus, and that's what I should do as well. In your life and in mine, we need to understand that God has called us to demonstrate his love and his grace and his truth to people who so desperately need it. Remember that even when you don't think you are, you're an example, and people are watching you to see what Christians are like and how you behave, and taking some cues from your example. Understand that having people look up to you is an opportunity. It's an opportunity to teach and to encourage them to think. And so it's not enough just to have someone watch what you do. You need to take the time and energy to explain what you're doing and why you're doing it so that you can say, like Paul, follow me as I follow Christ. Often the hardest times to be an example are when those who are watching us are doing so critically, when they're looking for us to mess up. But guess what? Those times are also the greatest opportunities that we have to reach out with God's love and God's truth. I hope that all of you fathers who are watching this enjoy that role as much as I do. And if you don't, I would encourage you to just think about the value of family. Think about the unique situation that you have to impact the life of another human being for good or ill. And take that responsibility so seriously. Let's work hard to provide an example of God's love and God's truth so that our family and everyone around us can know something of who God is through